Since YouTube isn't currently providing any revenue for these videos, Patreon is the only way I can keep this channel going. Support me there to help improve the content quality so I can bring you even more intense stories. Click the link in the description to join me on this journey and help us survive the apocalypse. Let's get straight into the story. The date on my phone says day 41, and I'm not sure I trust it anymore. I've been crossing off days on the wall with a black marker, 1 scratch per morning when I wake up. And the count on the wall says 41 too. So I guess that's right. 41 days since I sealed the hatch. 41 days since I pulled the ladder up after me and slid the deadbolt home and sat down on the floor with my back against the cold concrete wall and thought, okay. You're here. You did it. Now what? Now what turned out to be a lot more complicated than I expected. My name is Joel Whitaker. I'm 35 years old. I worked for 4 years as a senior research analyst at Dawnfield Media Group, which probably doesn't exist anymore in any meaningful sense. And I spent 11 months building a survival shelter in a drainage channel. Beneath a drainage channel, beneath a piece of land I bought for $8,000 cash from a county tax lien sale, which is either the smartest thing I've ever done or the thing that's going to make my eventual skeleton the most embarrassing one anyone ever finds. I'm going to tell you all of it. From the beginning. I've got time and I've got the recorder, and honestly, talking into this thing is the closest I get to feeling like a person anymore. So, from the beginning. I should probably explain what I did for a living, because it matters. Research analyst sounds more impressive than it was. What I actually did was sit in a room, sometimes the office, sometimes my apartment, usually in my underwear at 2 in the morning, and I read things. Government documents, epidemiological reports, academic preprints, leaked internal communications from pharmaceutical companies, WHO emergency declarations, CDC surveillance bulletins, social media posts in languages I couldn't read, but could run through translation tools, obscure public health journals from Eastern European universities, procurement records from military logistics contractors. I read everything. I cross-referenced everything. I built connections between things that weren't supposed to be connected and wrote them up for the editorial team, who would decide what was worth publishing. Most of what I found was boring. Genuinely boring. You'd be surprised how much of the scariest sounding information in the world is actually just routine. Viral outbreak in a province nobody's heard of. Turns out, it's a known pathogen with known containment protocols, and 6 months later, nobody remembers it happened. Chemical spill that sounds catastrophic on a local forum. Turns out it's a controlled incident, and the numbers being reported are elevated by about 300% because nobody checked the unit conversions. I got good at knowing the difference between something that looked alarming and something that actually was. That's why, when I found the thing in January, I knew immediately it was different. I'm not going to name the source. I'm still not going to do that, even now, even talking into a recorder in a room where nobody will probably ever hear this. Because the source was a person, a real person. And whether they're still alive or not, I don't know. And I'm not going to be the one who puts their name on record connected to something this big. What I can tell you is that the source worked inside a national biosafety program, not American, and I won't say which country, and had access to internal communications about a pathogen that had been isolated in a research facility and had been, in the words of the communication I was shown, exhibiting unexpected behavioral propagation characteristics in primate subjects. Unexpected behavioral propagation characteristics. I stared at that phrase for a long time, because in the context of that specific report, in the context of what else I could see around it, the containment failure notation, the subject disposition records, the escalating concern in the tone of subsequent messages that shifted from measured scientific language to something that read more like people who had started genuinely frightened. That phrase meant something very specific. It meant the infected animals weren't just sick. They were moving toward uninfected animals in a way that suggested the infection was driving behavior. Not random aggression, directed, purposeful in the most mechanical, stripped-down sense. I read the whole thing 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while. Then I opened it again and started cross-referencing. There were fragments. That's the thing about this kind of work. You almost never get a clean, complete picture from one source. What you get is fragments from 20 different sources that, if you arrange them correctly, start to look like something. I had a procurement record from a medical supply contractor in a European country, gloves, biohazard bags, sealed transport cases, purchased in quantities that made no sense for the facility size listed on the contract. I had 3 academic papers from the previous year about prion-adjacent infection mechanics in the central nervous system. Papers that had been published quietly, without the usual press releases or university announcements, which is unusual when researchers publish. I had a WHO situation report from November that had a section about a cluster of unexplained aggressive behavior incidents in a city I won't name, attributed to an unspecified febrile illness, and then a follow-up report from December that didn't mention the cluster at all, like it had just stopped being a thing worth mentioning. Gaps are as informative as data. I learned that early, and then I had the communication from my source, which filled in several of those gaps in a way that made my stomach feel like I'd swallowed a fistful of gravel. By the end of January, I had a working model of what I was looking at. And by the middle of February, I was fairly certain, not absolutely certain, but fairly, that whatever this was, it was coming. Not if. When. The question was where it would first reach population density sufficient to produce self-sustaining spread, and the question of when, and whether anything meaningful was being done at an official level to stop it. The answer to that last question, as best as I could tell from the things I could find, was probably not enough, and possibly nothing. That was the point at which I had to decide what to do with what I knew. I went to my editor first. Her name is Kathleen Briggs, 48 years old. 22 years in news media, sharp as a scalpel and about as warm. I liked her. I respected her. I thought she would take it seriously. I put the research in front of her on a Wednesday morning in a folder, physical printouts because I didn't want to send it over email. I had the source communication, the procurement records, the academic papers, the WHO gap, the subject disposition records. I'd spent 3 days organizing it into something coherent. I had a 17-page brief. She read it. Took her about 40 minutes. I sat across from her desk and watched her face. She put it down and said, "Joel, who's your source?" I told her I couldn't say. She said, "You know I can't run this without being able to verify the source." I said I understood that, but I wanted her to look at the corroborating material, the procurement records, and the academic papers, things that were independently verifiable. She said, "The procurement records are circumstantial. The academic papers are normal science. The WHO gap could be anything. The only thing that pulls all of this together into something coherent is the communication from a source I can't verify. I said, Kathleen, the behavioral characteristics described in that communication. She said, Joel, I need you to listen to me. What you're describing, if you strip away the careful language, sounds like a zombie outbreak. You know that, right? You know how this sounds. I knew how it sounded. I'd known that for weeks. That was the reason I'd spent so long cross-referencing, trying to build something that didn't depend entirely on the source, trying to make the secondary material strong enough to stand on its own. She said, even if everything in this folder is completely accurate, we are talking about publishing a story that tells people a zombie apocalypse is coming, from a source we cannot name, based on documents that can be read multiple ways. And I need to think about what that does. The panic, the liability. What happens if we're wrong? I said, what happens if we're right and we don't say anything? She looked at me for a moment, and I saw something in her face that I didn't know how to read at the time. I've thought about it a lot since. I think what it was, and I could be wrong, was that she believed me more than she was willing to say. But believing something and being willing to act on it are two completely different problems. She said, I can't run this story, Joel. Not in the current form. Keep working on it. If you can get me something more verifiable, come back. I took the folder and left. I sat in the parking garage below the office building for about 20 minutes, just in my car. The engine off. The parking garage air doing that particular thing it does where it smells like old rubber and concrete dust and a very faint whisper of exhaust from cars that passed through hours ago. I called my brother. His name is Patrick. 40 years old, lives in Denver, works in IT, has a wife named Carol and 2 kids I've seen a total of 4 times. We're not close in the way that brothers on TV are close. We talk on the phone maybe once a month, sometimes less. He picked up on the 3rd ring and said, Hey, what's up? I told him. Not everything, not the classified communication, but enough. Enough to convey that I thought something was coming, something bad, something people needed to prepare for. He was quiet for a bit. Then he said, Joel, is everything okay? Are you doing okay? I told him I was fine, that this wasn't a personal crisis, that I had information from credible sources that pointed to a serious outbreak risk. He said, okay, but you're talking about zombies. I said, I'm talking about a pathogen that modifies behavior. That's not. He said, buddy, that's zombies. He said it again. That word. Like it was the conversation ender, the thing that proved I'd lost the thread of reality. I didn't say anything for a while. He said, look, have you been sleeping? Because this kind of, when you're not sleeping well, you can. I told him I had to go. I hung up. Then I sat in the parking garage for a while longer and looked at the concrete pillar in front of my car and thought about the primate subject disposition records. The way the language in those records shifted from clinical to something else. Something that read like the people writing them were choosing their words very carefully because they were scared and didn't want the fear to show. I went back upstairs and I started making a list. The thing about being a researcher is that you're good at information and you're almost certainly terrible at everything physical. I was. I could tell you the mortality rate of every major outbreak in the last century, could find you the FEMA guidelines for emergency preparedness, could name every government stockpiling program and its contents and location. And I had never done a single thing with my hands that wasn't typing. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. My dad was a civil engineer. Not the kind that builds things, the kind that sits at a desk and calculates load tolerances. My mom taught high school English. We lived in a house with a 2-car garage and a lawn that my dad hired someone to mow. I did not grow up hunting or building or fixing things. I grew up reading and sitting and thinking, which are great skills for about 30% of the problems you encounter in an ordinary life, and absolutely catastrophic preparation for the other 70. So when I started making my list in February, I had to be honest with myself about what I could actually do versus what I needed to learn. The list had 2 sides. What I knew I could handle: research, planning, logistics, procurement, meaning buying things from the internet and having them delivered. What I could not handle: construction, physical security, anything involving tools or materials I'd never touched. I sat with the list for a day. Then I went to the internet and I started learning. I watched construction videos on YouTube for 3 weeks straight. Load-bearing basics, concrete mixing, waterproofing, ventilation, electrical basics. I read survival forums, homesteader forums, off-grid living communities. I found a subreddit dedicated to underground shelter construction that had several detailed threads from people who'd actually built them. Not preppers screaming about the apocalypse. Just methodical people who decided they wanted a bolt hole and had documented the process with photos and measurements and lessons learned. I cross-referenced their methods with FEMA blast shelter guidelines and some Cold War-era civil defense construction manuals I found in a digitized government archive. Those manuals were from the 1960s, and they were incredibly specific. The government had spent a lot of money in that era figuring out exactly how to build something a person could survive in underground, and then apparently stopped caring about that knowledge. But the manuals were still there, just sitting in a digital archive, waiting. I read everything. I took notes. I made spreadsheets. And then, at the beginning of March, I drove out to Crawford County and I bought $8,000 worth of mostly worthless scrubland from a county tax sale. The land purchase deserves some explanation because it wasn't random. I'd been looking at parcels for 2 weeks. What I needed was something with specific characteristics. Remote enough that I wouldn't have neighbors immediately adjacent. Accessible enough that I could drive to it in a regular car to bring materials. On land where the geology was appropriate for underground construction. No high water table, no bedrock too close to the surface. And cheap, because I had maybe $40,000 in savings after years of working for a media company that paid well, but not extravagantly. And I needed most of that for materials and supplies. The Crawford County parcel was 8 acres of scrub woodland that nobody wanted. The county had seized it for back taxes 9 years ago and tried to sell it 4 times at auction without success. The soil survey said the water table was about 18 feet down, which was workable. The topography had a natural depression running through the eastern edge of the property, part of a drainage system, a dry channel that only ran water during heavy rain, which meant I had a natural concealment feature and a reason to be digging that wouldn't look obviously like shelter construction to anyone who might drive past. I paid $8,000 cash. The county clerk's office smelled like old carpet, and the woman who processed the paperwork was eating a granola bar and never looked up from her screen. I drove back to Columbus with the deed on the passenger seat and stopped at a hardware store on the way home. I bought a shovel, my first one. I looked at it in the hardware store parking lot for a minute, just this orange-handled spade, the kind with a metal collar where the handle meets the blade, and I thought, okay. You've never done this before and you have maybe 2 months and you have to figure it out. I drove home. I went to sleep. The next day, I drove back to Crawford County and started digging. I should tell you about the shelter before I tell you about the digging, because the digging makes more sense if you know what I was trying to build. The design I settled on after all that research was a two-chamber system. Not a single room. Two separate spaces connected by an interior door, which gives you an airlock effect. The outer chamber is 6 feet wide by 10 feet long, low ceiling, about 5.5 feet, which is uncomfortable, but serves as a staging area, a place to leave contaminated clothing or equipment before entering the main space. The inner chamber is 12 feet long by 8 feet wide, 6.5 foot ceiling, reinforced with poured concrete walls 8 inches thick, with a second ventilation system that can be sealed independently if the outer chamber is compromised. Access is from above. A metal hatch set into the floor of a wooden structure I built to look like a small equipment shed. The kind of thing that might store tools or lumber on a rural property. The hatch is recessed below grade level by about 8 inches and covered by a plywood panel that sits underneath what looks like a stack of old lumber. So from the surface, a shed. Inside the shed, what looks like a floor. Under the floor, the hatch. Below the hatch, an 11-foot vertical drop via a fixed metal ladder into the outer chamber. The drainage channel runs alongside the shed, which is positioned at the lowest point of that natural depression. And because water occasionally moves through that channel during rain, the soil in the area around the shed looks disturbed and eroded in a way that makes the construction marks less obvious. It just looks like someone built a shed in a wet area, which people do. The ventilation is the part that took me the longest to figure out. You need air. Obviously, you need air. But you can't have an obvious pipe sticking out of the ground that someone can find and block or pour something into, or that could let in contaminated air from above. What I built is a horizontal run of 2-inch PVC pipe that goes underground from the inner chamber outward for 30 feet before turning upward to a vent pipe buried inside a tree stump, an actual stump from a tree I cut down. With a filter assembly I built using activated charcoal and HEPA filter material from an air purifier I disassembled. Air comes in from a direction nobody would expect through a filter, and the vent pipe is invisible inside the stump unless you know it's there. I also have a hand crank bellows system for if the natural ventilation becomes insufficient, and 2 battery-powered CO2 monitors that I calibrate every 3 days. The water system is a separate story. There's a 500-gallon tank sunk into the earth beside the outer chamber, filled by gravity feed from 2 large catchment panels on the shed roof that I disguised as solar panels. They look like solar panels from a distance, are the right size and color, but they're actually flat PVC collection surfaces that funnel rainwater through a filter assembly into the tank. I also have 60 liters of additional water in sealed containers as backup. The tank level goes down about 1 liter a day with careful rationing. Food. I spent 3 months filling the inner chamber with supplies. 412 cans, dried beans, rice, rolled oats, pasta, canned vegetables, canned protein. Medical supplies, 4 full first aid kits, a dental kit I bought off a medical supply website, antibiotics I obtained in a way that was technically legal in the state I ordered them from, various painkillers, bandages, suture kits, batteries, hundreds of them, various sizes, 4 battery banks, 2 hand crank radios, 3 hand crank flashlights, 1 car battery with a solar trickle charger connected to a small external panel that I ran through a channel in the concrete, sealed at both ends. Books, 47 of them, mostly practical guides, some fiction. a notebook and 47 ballpoint pens, a calendar. I'm not going to tell you what I didn't think of, because I found out what I missed the hard way over the last 41 days, and I'd rather tell those parts of the story when they come up naturally. The digging took most of March and all of April. I drove to the property on weekends initially, staying in a tent I'd pitched at the far edge of the tree line. Then I took 2 weeks of personal leave from work in the middle of March, telling Kathleen I needed time to work on the story, which was technically true. I continued the research remotely from the property, working from my laptop in the evenings after digging during the day. I rented an excavator for the main dig, which cost more than I wanted it to, but saved several weeks of hand digging that I physically couldn't have done in time. The rental company's guy drove it out on a flatbed and didn't ask questions. I told him I was putting in a root cellar. He said cool, unloaded the machine, and left. I had never operated an excavator in my life. The YouTube videos helped. Not as much as I'd have liked, but enough. It took me a full day to get comfortable with the controls, working in the drainage channel area where the natural depression gave me some cover and where disturbed soil would look less out of place. I hit a large rock about 6 feet down on the second day that I had to break up with a rental jackhammer, which added half a day. I hit a small underground water channel at 9 feet on the third day, which scared the hell out of me. I thought I'd misjudged the water table, but it turned out to be a narrow seep that only ran in wet conditions, and I diverted it with a drainage pipe before pouring the gravel bed. The concrete work was the hardest part physically. I mixed most of it by hand in a rented mixer. My hands blistered, the blisters popped, they blistered again in different places. My back hurt in a way I'd never experienced before, a deep, grinding ache that didn't go away with sleep. I lost 6 pounds in 3 weeks just from the work. I'd been a desk person my entire adult life, and my body had no idea what to do with what I was asking of it. But I kept going. Every day I drove out to the property at 6 in the morning, and I worked until I couldn't anymore, and I drove back to the tent, and I lay on my sleeping bag, and I looked at the pole of the tent above me, and I thought about what I'd seen in that communication. The primate subject records, the behavioral propagation characteristics. And I got up the next day and went back to work. I should tell you about the conversation I had with my coworker Derek, because it was the last time I really tried to tell someone. Derek Marsh, 29 years old, junior research analyst, had been at Dawnfield for about 18 months. Came from a journalism background, had a nose for a story, as they say, which is a phrase that always annoyed me slightly, because nobody ever says that about the stories that turn out to be wrong. He was smart, quicker than most of the other junior staff. He came to my desk at the end of April and asked me if I was okay because I'd been taking a lot of personal leave and looked like I hadn't been sleeping. I had not been sleeping. I was driving 3 hours round trip multiple times a week, in addition to working full days. And the physical work was catching up with me in ways that showed on my face. I decided to tell him. Not the full story. I'd learned from the Kathleen conversation that presenting everything at once didn't work. But enough. The procurement records, the academic papers, the WHO gap, the basic pattern I was seeing. He listened. He actually listened, which Kathleen had also done. So I'm not saying she didn't. He asked questions. Good questions. Where did the procurement records come from? How reliable was the source of the academic papers? What was the baseline for a WHO situation report gap before it became significant? And then he said, okay, but the one thing holding this together is the source communication, right? Like, without that, this is circumstantial. I said, The circumstantial evidence is substantial. He said, "It's suggestive. It's not proof." I said, "I don't think we're going to have proof until people are already dying." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, the way people say things when they're trying to tell you something without quite saying it directly, "Joel, has this, taken over a bit? Are you able to put it down at the end of the day?" I said, "No, I can't put it down because it's real." He said, "But what if it's not? What if," and I'm not saying I think this, I'm asking, what if the source is wrong or lying? Or what if you've been looking at this so long you've started to see a pattern that isn't really there? That was the question I'd asked myself 600 times. The thing about being a researcher is you know about confirmation bias. You know how easy it is to build a case for something you've already decided is true. I'd stress-tested my own conclusions multiple times. I'd deliberately looked for evidence that contradicted my interpretation. I'd sent the source communication, with all identifying information removed, to a former colleague who worked in infectious disease epidemiology, without telling her what I thought it meant, and just asked her what she made of it. She'd written back, "This is concerning. Where did this come from? Can we talk?" I hadn't told Derek that. I didn't say it now, because it would mean explaining more than I was ready to explain. I said, "I've checked my reasoning, Derek, multiple times. I think this is real." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, and his voice was genuine, not unkind, just genuinely confused, "But it's zombies, Joel." There it was again, that word. That word that seemed to function as a kind of cognitive off switch for everyone I'd tried to talk to. I said, "Yeah." He said, that's not," I said, "I know." I went back to my desk. That afternoon, I took stock of how the shelter construction was going, and I calculated that I had about 3 weeks of work remaining, and I decided I was done trying to tell people. Here is what I did not expect: the loneliness of being right. I'm not saying that in a self-congratulatory way. There's no satisfaction in being right about something like this. What I mean is, in the 6 weeks between that conversation with Derek and the day the outbreak actually began, I existed in a very specific and very unpleasant state. I went to work. I did my job. I sat in meetings about stories I no longer cared about at all. I ate lunch alone because I'd become noticeably strange to the people around me, and nobody quite knew how to interact with me anymore. And every day, I was holding this knowledge that felt like a physical weight, this thing I could feel pressing on the inside of my chest, and I couldn't put it down, and I couldn't share it, and I couldn't do anything about it except drive out to Crawford County and pour concrete and run PVC pipe and stack cans of beans in a room underground. I thought about my parents. My dad had a heart condition, and my mom had diabetes. Neither of them was in good physical shape. Both of them were in their late 60s. And the shelter I was building had exactly one person in mind: me. I'd built it for one person because I hadn't believed anyone would come with me. I thought about telling them. I almost did twice. I called my mom on a Thursday evening in late April and talked to her for 40 minutes about nothing: her garden, a book she was reading, what my nephew had said at dinner the previous week, apparently something about dinosaurs. She couldn't stop laughing about it. And I kept almost saying it and then not saying it because I knew how it would land. Because I'd already seen how it landed. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the apartment parking lot and pressed my head against the steering wheel. The steering wheel smelled like vinyl and old sunscreen, and a little bit like the concrete dust I couldn't entirely get out of my hands, no matter how many times I washed them. There's a particular granular feeling you get in the lines of your palms when you've been working with concrete. It gets into the skin and dries there, and you can feel it for days. My palms had felt like that since March. I didn't call my parents again for another 2 weeks. I finished the shelter on May 11th. I know the exact date because I wrote it in my notebook. The first entry just May 11th. Done. Then nothing else for several lines. I stood in the inner chamber for the first time, with everything stacked and organized, and the door to the outer chamber closed, and I looked at what I'd made with my own hands. And I didn't feel proud or relieved. I felt afraid. Because standing in it made it real in a way that building it hadn't quite. And being real meant that everything I'd been carrying since January was actually true. The ceiling was 6.5 feet high, which sounds fine until you're in it. And then it sits about 8 inches above your head, and the walls are close, and the air smells like concrete and plastic, and the slight sourness of sealed food containers. I had a cot against the right wall, a folding table with the battery bank, and the hand crank radio, and the CO2 monitor, a shelf unit full of supplies, a box of books, a bucket with a lid, toilet arrangements, which I'd rather not describe in detail, but which I'd thought through carefully using information about long-term underground habitation, an LED lamp on the ceiling run from the battery bank, a separate battery-powered lamp as backup. I stood there and breathed for a while. Then I went back up, closed the hatch, drove to a gas station 30 minutes away, bought a terrible coffee, and drank it in the parking lot, watching the highway. Normal cars, normal people. A woman at the next pump with a toddler in the back seat who was doing that thing small children do where they make noise continuously, without it quite being words. A truck driver filling up an 18-wheeler. A kid on a bike cutting through the lot. May 11th. 3 weeks before the first official reports. 6 weeks before things got bad enough in the city that you couldn't pretend they weren't happening. I need to tell you about the last week before I came down here, because it was the worst week of my life. And I think I'd rather say it plainly than sit on it. May 25th was the first report I found. Not the first one that made the news. That was a week later. But the first one I could find in the places I knew to look. An emergency dispatch log from a city hospital, not the one connected to my source, a different city, but in the same region. Logged under mass casualty event. Cause undetermined patient presentation consistent with neurological incident. 37 admissions in a 4-hour window. The log was accessible through a public records request channel that most people don't know exists, and I'd set up an automated pull on months before. 37 admissions in 4 hours at a single hospital for anything called cause undetermined. I pulled up the secondary data. Police incident reports from the same city, same date. Abnormally high number of calls logged under disturbance and assault. Not abnormally high in terms of numbers you'd panic about, but abnormally clustered in geography, all within about a 6-block radius. I sat with that for a long time. I went to work on May 26th because I didn't know what else to do. I sat at my desk and I watched the news feeds, and I did my actual job on autopilot, and I waited. On May 28th, a story ran on a local news outlet in that city about a mysterious illness causing hospital overcrowding. The story described patients arriving in an agitated state, with high fevers and apparent inability to communicate. The local health authority had issued a statement attributing it to a possible outbreak of encephalitic illness and asking the public to stay calm. I sat at my desk and read that story 3 times, staying calm. On May 30th, there were 2 more cities, different regions. Hospital reports, police logs, the same cluster pattern. I went to Kathleen's office. I put the printouts on her desk. I said, "It's starting." She looked at the printouts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll start making calls." I said, "Kathleen." She said, "Joel, I said I'll start making calls. Let me work." I went back to my desk. I called Patrick in Denver, and he picked up, and I said, "Patrick, listen to me. Get your family somewhere rural. Don't wait for an official announcement. Get out of the city now." He said, "Joel, what?" I said, "Patrick, please. This isn't me being paranoid. This is real and it's starting, and I need you to take Carol and the kids and go somewhere without a lot of people." "Does Carol's family still have that place in?" He said, "What are you talking about? What's starting?" I told him as quickly as I could. The research, the source, the hospital logs, the cluster pattern. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Joel, are you at work right now?" I said, "Yes." He said, Can you maybe talk to someone there? Like, not about the story, but just, is there someone at your company you trust who you can..." He thought I was having a breakdown. He thought the research stress had finally pushed me over some edge, and what I needed was a friendly co-worker to sit with me and make sure I was okay. I hung up on him. First time I'd ever hung up on my brother. I called my mom, and she didn't answer. I called a former colleague, the epidemiologist I'd sent the source communication to months before. She picked up immediately, and the first thing she said was, "Have you been watching the news?" I said, "Tell me what you know." She said, "It's in 3 cities that we know of, officially. Joel, the communication you sent me in February, is that source still active? Because if you can get me more current information from that person, I need to pass it up my chain." I said, "I'll try." I tried. The source didn't respond. I've tried 4 more times since then, and the account I used to contact them hasn't shown any activity. I don't know what happened to them. On June 3rd, it was in 7 cities. On June 5th, the first major media outlet ran a story. On June 7th, the WHO issued an emergency declaration. On June 8th, the CDC advised Americans in 12 metro areas to shelter in place. June 8th. I went to Kathleen's office one more time and said, "I'm leaving." She looked up from her computer. Her face was pale and there were dark circles under her eyes. And she'd been in the building for about 20 hours straight because the whole editorial team was in full crisis mode. She said, "Okay." I said, I have a place. If things get bad here, there's a place in Crawford County. Concrete structure, 6 weeks of food. I built it. If things get bad and you need..." She said, "Joel." I stopped. She said, "Go. Take care of yourself. We're going to keep publishing as long as we can." I said, "Kathleen, I'm serious about the..." She said, "Go." I went. I drove home, packed everything I had left in a bag, additional medication, the last of my battery supplies, my phone and 4 charging cables, a small solar panel I hadn't brought out yet. Drove to a grocery store and walked out with 3 bags of anything that would last. Trail mix, peanut butter, crackers, dried fruit. The store was already starting to look strange, not empty, not panicked, but wrong in a way that's hard to describe. People moving faster than usual. People on their phones while they walked. A woman in the checkout line ahead of me, talking in a low, urgent voice to whoever was on her phone, saying, "But where are we supposed to go, Tom? You can't just say go. Go where?" I paid in cash. Drove to Crawford County. The drive was 3 hours because the interstate was backed up, longer than usual. People moving. Not a panic yet, not a real evacuation. Just that particular congestion that happens when 20% of a population decides to do something at once. I sat in it and listened to the radio, which was cycling through increasingly alarming reports. Official language getting more urgent, the careful qualifications dropping off one by one as the situation outran the language the officials had prepared for it. At the 2-hour mark, there was an incident on the road. About a quarter mile ahead of me, traffic stopped completely. I couldn't see what it was. Just brake lights, and then nothing moving. I sat there for 20 minutes. Then there was a sound I couldn't place at first. Coming from a few cars up, raised voices. Then something that wasn't voices. And the cars around me started to edge onto the shoulder in both directions, people getting out and running. And I understood without seeing it exactly what was happening. I drove onto the shoulder. Grass on both sides, scraped the undercarriage on something, kept going. Got around the stopped cars, kept driving. I didn't look back. I know what it sounds like. I've thought about it every single day since. But I didn't look back. I got to the property at dusk, parked the car in the trees where I'd prepared a spot, dug a shallow depression, covered it with a tarp and pine branches. If anyone walked by, it would look like a pile of brush. Not invisible, but not a parked car. I carried everything down into the shelter, checked the supplies, the water level, the ventilation system. Ran through the checklist I'd written in the notebook. Everything was where I'd left it. I pulled the ladder up, slid the deadbolt, sat down on the floor with my back against the concrete wall. 41 days ago. Day 1. I should probably go through the days in some kind of order. But the thing is that the first 2 weeks blur together in a way that makes it hard to separate them. When you're underground and there's no natural light, and you're on a controlled light schedule you set for yourself, the days don't feel like days. They feel like long periods of being awake, followed by periods of lying on a cot trying to sleep, and the border between them is arbitrary. What I remember about the first 2 weeks is this. The radio. I had the hand-crank radio running almost continuously for the first 5 days. I'd tune through the FM dial, the AM dial, the shortwave bands, and I'd listen to everything I could find. News reports, emergency broadcasts, official statements. The gradual degradation of organized information as sources went down one by one. The progression was very clear in retrospect. Day 1, Day 2. Normal news infrastructure. Stations broadcasting continuously, reporters in the field, official press conferences, the kinds of information structures we've built up over decades. Day 3. Some gaps starting to show. Some stations going to automated emergency broadcast loops. Day 4. FM mostly gone, AM still active. Day 5. The emergency broadcast system in my region went to an automated loop that said, "This is an emergency broadcast. Stay in your home. Do not go outside. Await further instructions," on a 10-minute cycle. It said that for 4 days, and then it stopped saying anything. Day 9. I found a ham radio operator broadcasting on shortwave. A man, sounded middle-aged, based somewhere in Pennsylvania, no name given. He was broadcasting a continuous situation report. What he knew, what he'd heard, what he could observe from wherever he was. He kept a calm, methodical voice, the kind of voice that makes you think this person has been preparing for this moment for years, and maybe wasn't entirely wrong to do so. I listened to him for 6 hours that day, until my battery bank got low and I had to shut off the radio and crank it back up. Day 12. His signal went quiet. I don't know what happened. I look for it still every night on shortwave. Nothing. What else about the first 2 weeks? The sounds from outside. I could hear things through the concrete and earth. Not clearly. The 8-inch walls and the soil above deadened most sound. But when something made enough noise close enough to the surface, it registered. A low, indistinct presence. The first time I heard it, on day 3, I went completely still on my cot and didn't move for about 10 minutes. It was coming from the direction of the access road, which is about 400 meters from my shed. An irregular sound. Not a voice, not exactly. A continuous, low, undirected vocalization. The only way I can describe it is like someone was sleepwalking and making the sound you sometimes make in the middle of a bad dream, except constant and more than one person. And underneath it, footsteps in dry grass, the particular soft shuffling of something that was moving without any particular urgency. They passed. Whatever it was. The sound moved through and away over about 20 minutes, and then the surface was quiet again. I lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about the research, about behavioral propagation characteristics, about the primate subject disposition records, about the fact that I was not wrong. That thought didn't make me feel better. I want to be clear about that. Being right about something like this does not feel good. It does not feel like vindication or satisfaction. It feels like standing at the bottom of a very deep hole that you built with your own hands, listening to something pass over you in the dark. Day 15 through 20. The first real routine. I woke up at what I decided was 7 in the morning. Alarm on my phone, battery bank keeping it charged. And I turned on the small LED lamp, the ceiling one, which gave the room a kind of flat, neutral light. Not warm, not cold exactly, just even. I've started thinking of it as the color of a cloudy Tuesday. I ate breakfast. Breakfast was, and has remained, oatmeal from the dry stores. 1 cup of rolled oats cooked in about 1.5 cups of water over the camp stove. A compact butane unit I'd bought and stored down here, 24 extra fuel canisters, which I'm burning through faster than I planned because of the cooking. The oatmeal takes maybe 8 minutes. I put a tablespoon of dried fruit in it, and sometimes a bit of peanut butter, because caloric density matters, and because peanut butter is one of those things that makes another thing taste like something. After breakfast, I did a water check. The tank level, the reserve containers. Logged the number in the notebook. Then a CO2 check. The monitor was reading normal, which meant the ventilation was working, but I checked it anyway, because the consequences of not checking are worse than the minor paranoia of checking. Then I allocated myself 2 hours for what I was calling exercise, which was mostly just moving in the limited space I had. I'd marked a 3-meter loop around the inner chamber, and I walked it. And walked it. For 2 hours every morning. It sounds intensely boring because it was intensely boring. But I was already starting to feel the effects of no movement by day 10. A kind of stiffness that went beyond just soreness. More like my body was confused about what it was supposed to be doing. And I'd read enough about the physiological consequences of prolonged inactivity to know that keeping blood moving was not optional. Then I read. Every afternoon I read. I had 47 books, and I was working through them methodically. I was 3 books in by day 15. I'd brought a mix of practical guides, field medicine, wilderness survival, food preservation, and fiction, which I'd chosen for length and not for theme, and which included, as it turned out, a military thriller that was so specifically and painfully accurate in its description of a disease outbreak that I put it face down after 3 chapters and haven't picked it up since. Then I'd eat dinner, the second meal of the day, because I was eating twice rather than 3 times to stretch the supplies. The calculations I'd done before sealing in suggested that at a modest but adequate caloric intake, I had food for approximately 90 to 100 days. I'm at day 41, and I'm roughly on track, maybe slightly ahead on some things and slightly behind on others. Then I'd work the radio for an hour or 2 and write in the notebook and try to sleep. That was the routine. That's still the routine. The specifics have changed in places for reasons I'll get to. But the structure has remained because the structure is the only thing I have that feels like a day instead of just more time passing. Day 22 was the first time I went outside. I need to explain why I went outside because the reason is not entirely rational, and I want to be honest about that. I went outside because I needed to know if the car was still there. That's it. That's the whole reason. I needed to know if the car I'd hidden in the trees was still there. Because if it wasn't, it meant someone had been on the property. And if someone had been on the property, I needed to factor that into my thinking. And I knew this information wouldn't actually change what I did on a day-to-day basis in the shelter. But I needed to know anyway. And that need got loud enough by day 22 that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I prepared for it the way I'd read you should. Spent 2 hours listening at the hatch before opening it, a total silence exercise. Lying on the floor of the outer chamber with my ear near the hatch and just listening. Heard nothing beyond the ambient sounds you'd expect. Wind moving through leaves, distant birds, twice the sound of something small moving through undergrowth, stopping, moving again. Normal sounds, not the shuffling vocalization combination I'd learned to recognize. I opened the hatch slowly, lifted it about 2 inches, and held it there for a minute. The air that came in was different from the air in the shelter. Wetter, greener, with a faint edge of something that wasn't quite decay, but was in that direction, like something had died within a few hundred meters and was slowly returning to the earth. Not a strong smell. Just there. I climbed out, stood on the shed floor and let my eyes adjust. The shed has a small gap at the roof line, not a window, just an unintentional space between the wall and the roof, about 2 inches wide. And some light came in from there, enough to see by, if barely. I opened the shed door a few inches, stood behind it and looked through the gap. The property looked largely the same. The scrub trees were the same. The drainage channel was overgrown in the way it always was at this time of year, summer growth filling in the grass between the banks. The sky was overcast, a flat gray, and the light was early morning, maybe 7 or 8. I didn't see anything moving. I stepped out and went to the tree line at a fast walk, keeping low out of old instinct, even though I didn't fully understand why. The car was still there, under the tarp and the branches, exactly where I'd left it. I put my hand on the tarp and felt the shape of it underneath and stood there for a moment. Then I looked around properly and saw the thing near the road. It was about 200 meters away, standing in the tall grass at the edge of where my property met the county road. Standing, not moving, just there, facing generally in my direction. I couldn't make out the face clearly at that distance. The grass was chest high and the overcast light was flat and featureless. But the shape was unmistakably a person, or what had been a person. The way it stood was wrong in the way that all of them stand wrong. A kind of loose, unweighted stillness, like a marionette at rest. I did not move. Neither did it. For about 3 minutes, we did that. Me absolutely still in the trees. It absolutely still at the road. Then something happened that I still can't fully explain. A sound, somewhere in the opposite direction, maybe a kilometer away. The kind of sound you might not notice at all. A branch falling, maybe, or something settling. And the thing at the road turned its whole body in that direction and started moving, going away from me along the road edge, heading toward the sound, and disappeared into the grass. I went back to the shed, went back down, sealed the hatch, sat on the floor in the outer chamber for a long time. That was the last time I went outside until day 35. Day 25 through 30. The water problem. The rainwater collection system worked exactly as designed. The problem was that it had not rained. The tank had been full when I sealed in, 500 liters, which at my rationing rate gave me a comfortable margin. But I'd also been using slightly more water than planned for cooking, because the food I was eating required water and I hadn't quite calibrated that correctly. By day 25, the tank was at about 380 liters. This was still fine, still well within margins. But I was looking at a dry stretch. The weather I could infer from the temperature and humidity changes in the ventilation. Airflow suggested no significant rain in the recent past, and no way to know when that would change. I dropped my water usage by 30%. Stopped the camp stove cooking entirely for 2 days and ate things that didn't need cooking. Crackers, peanut butter, canned fruit which has water in it already. Cut my water ration for non-cooking uses from 1 liter a day to 700 milliliters. The headache started on day 27, low-grade persistent, sitting at the base of my skull. Dehydration headaches have a very specific character. They don't pulse the way stress headaches do. They just sit there, steady and dull and immovable. I drank an extra 200 milliliters and lay down, and they went away in a few hours. On day 29, it rained. I heard it clearly even through the concrete. The different quality of sound in the ventilation, the slight change in air pressure, and eventually the sound itself, which came through as a low, continuous white noise above me. I went into the outer chamber and put my ear near the hatch, and the sound was unmistakable. The tank filled to 420 liters over the course of that day and the next. I went back to my normal water ration with something that was embarrassingly close to gratitude. The thing about living in a confined space on limited resources is that your emotional register shifts. Things that wouldn't have meant anything in ordinary life, rain, a working lamp, an extra cracker, acquire a weight that's disproportionate to their objective significance. I cried a little when the rain started. Not much, a few seconds. Then I felt stupid about it and stopped. Day 31. I found the notebook. I should clarify. I found a different notebook, not mine. I'd been doing a systematic inventory of the shelter, going through everything on the shelves and in the corner storage area and cataloging it precisely, because I'd started to suspect I might be off on some of my calculations and wanted a clean count. I moved a case of canned soup that had been against the back wall since I'd stacked it in April, and behind it, wedged in the space between the back wall and the corner shelf, was a small green spiral notebook. I stood there holding it for a moment. It had not been there when I sealed in. I was completely certain of this, because I had packed and stacked everything in this room myself over 3 days in early May, and I would have found a notebook behind the soup case. I would definitely have found it. There was no way. I opened it. The first page had a date, May 30th. I sealed in on June 8th. May 30th was 9 days before I came down here. The handwriting was small and precise, slightly slanted. Not mine. The ink was a dark blue, slightly smeared on some letters like whoever wrote it had been pressing hard. It said, "I've been in the structure since Monday. Found the access by accident. Stepped on the hatch cover in the shed and heard it move. I know whose this is. I don't know where he is. If he comes back and finds this, I'm sorry. I needed somewhere, and there was nowhere else. I've been eating as little as possible. I put money in the box on the shelf. I'm not going to stay longer than I have to. If something happens to me before I leave, my name is Sandra Holt. I live at 44 Birchwood Drive, Crestfield. I'm a nurse. I came up here from the city with my car and ran out of fuel on Route 9. I've been walking for 2 days. I sat down on the cot, read it again, then again. She had been in my shelter I worked backwards. If she came in on Monday, May 30th, and I arrived on June 8th, that was 9 days. She had been in here for 9 days before I arrived. The money she mentioned was an envelope in a box on the middle shelf that I'd been using to store spare batteries. Inside it was $240 in mixed bills and a folded piece of paper that said, "For food. Sorry for taking things. I tried to take as little as possible. S." I went through the stores carefully, looking at the count, the careful stacking, trying to identify what was missing. It was genuinely difficult to tell. I'd stacked everything in a specific order, but I'd been here for 31 days, and I'd been taking from the stacks daily, so the configuration had changed. What I could identify, based on my rough original count, was that maybe a dozen cans were gone. Beans, a couple of soup cans, a tin of sardines. One of the water reserve containers was about a quarter empty. A small first aid kit had been opened, which I'd noticed before and assumed was from my own use, and now realized wasn't. And she was gone before I arrived. She left on her own, and she took as little as she could. Where did she go? I thought about Sandra Holt of Crestfield for a long time that night. A nurse, walking 2 days from her car on Route 9, finding an underground shelter by accident, sleeping in it for 9 days while eating as little as possible and leaving money for what she took. I still think about her. What happened to her? Whether she found somewhere safe. I added her name to the back of my notebook. Sandra Holt, 44 Birchwood Drive, Crestfield. I don't know why. I just felt like she should be written somewhere that wasn't just tucked behind a suitcase. Day 33. The sounds changed. From the beginning, the sounds I'd hear from outside fell into 2 categories. The ambient sounds, wind, birds, the occasional animal in the undergrowth, and the human sounds, which were irregular, unpredictable, and recognizable by their particular quality. The vocalization, the unstructured movement. On day 33, I heard something new. It was midday, my lamp was on, I was reading, and I became aware of a sound that I couldn't immediately categorize. Higher pitch than the vocalization I'd learned to associate with the infected. Structured in a way that vocalization wasn't. A repeated pattern, rhythmic, almost like someone was deliberately making a sound to carry. And it lasted for a while, maybe 20 minutes, before it faded. I couldn't tell what it was. I listened very hard. The sound characteristics through 2 concrete walls and a meter of earth are strange. Things get compressed, frequencies drop out. What you're left with is a narrow slice of the original sound. But by the end, I'd started to think it might be someone speaking, not infected. Infected don't speak in sentences, don't maintain patterns, don't deliberately project sound for communication. What I heard on day 33 had the rhythm of language. Someone talking, moving through the area, talking. I went to the outer chamber and lay with my ear near the hatch for an hour. But by then, it was gone. Whatever it was, it had passed through. I didn't go up. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was the sensible calculation. I had no way to know how many of them might be in the area, and one person calling out was entirely consistent with that person being chased by a group, which would make the surface very dangerous. But part of it was something else. Something I don't have a perfectly clean word for. I was afraid of breaking what I had. Down here, in the shelter, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The variables were limited, controlled. I had a system, I had a routine, and it was working in the minimal sense that I was still alive and still functional. The moment I introduced another person into that system, all of those variables multiplied. So I didn't go up. The next morning, I lay on my cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about whoever had been speaking up there, and about Sandra Holt walking 2 days from her car, and about Patrick with his wife and kids, and about my parents, about the granola bar the county clerk was eating when I paid for my parcel of scrubland. I ate breakfast and walked my loop and read my book. Day 35. The second time I went outside. By this point, I had been in the inner chamber almost exclusively for 13 days since the last surface visit. There's something that happens to your perception when you're in a confined, artificially lit space for extended periods. I'd read about it in some of the Cold War shelter research. But reading about it is very different from experiencing it. The walls start to feel like they're at a different distance than they actually are. Not dramatically, not in a way that screams hallucination. Just a subtle wrongness, a sense that your brain is having to work harder than usual to locate things in space. My depth perception was slightly off. I kept misjudging how far away the shelf was when I reached for it. I needed to go outside, not to check the car this time, just to be in actual space, under actual sky, even briefly. I did the same preparation. 2 hours of silence at the hatch, listening. Opened it carefully. Checked the shed. Opened the shed door. Different time of day, late afternoon. The light warmer and more horizontal than the last time, going orange at the edge of the sky through the trees. I stepped outside and stood for a moment. Just stood there. Felt the ground under my feet, which was different from the concrete floor in a way I felt through my whole body. Slightly uneven, giving slightly the grass against my ankles. The air smelled like green things and dried grass, and somewhere a little further off, something else. Not the faint decay note from last time, something more immediate. I looked around the property. Nothing at the road, which was where I'd seen the one standing last time. But there was something in the drainage channel. About 60 meters from the shed, where the channel banks were higher and the grass was thicker, there was a shape half concealed by the grass, lying down. I couldn't immediately tell if it was a person or just a pile of fabric, something that had blown in, because it was the same washed-out color as dried vegetation. Then it moved. A small, slow movement. Not the purposeful movement of the infected, just a shift of position. Someone lying in the drainage channel, alive. I stood at the shed door for probably 2 full minutes, just watching. The shape moved again, slightly, in a way that read as pain or exhaustion or both. The infected don't do that. They don't rest, don't curl up, don't make small adjustments of comfort. Whatever was in the drainage channel was still a person. The sane, sensible, strategically correct thing to do was go back inside and seal the hatch. I went to the drainage channel. He was about 20 years old, maybe younger, hard to tell because he was in a bad state, filthy, dehydrated in a way that aged the face, lying on his side in the channel bottom with one arm under his head and the other pressed against his stomach. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, both of which were so dirty they'd lost their original color. His shoes were the kind of canvas sneakers that are basically useless for walking long distances on rough ground, and the right one had split at the sole. He wasn't unconscious. When I came down the channel bank, he turned his head and looked at me, and his eyes were clear, not the wrong kind of unfocus that I'd learned to associate with fever, just the specific exhausted blankness of someone who hasn't slept well or eaten enough for a while. He said, "You real?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." Then he lay his head back down. I looked at him. I thought about Sandra Holt and her $240 and her nurse's sensibility about eating as little as possible. I said, "Are you bitten?" He said, "No." I said, "Can I check?" He looked at me again, and for a moment something moved across his face that I couldn't read. Not anger exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been asked to show ID so many times it stopped feeling insulting and started feeling just exhausting. He pushed up his sleeve and held out both arms. No bites. He rolled over with visible effort and lifted the back of his shirt. No bites. He checked his own neck for me, which he'd clearly done before. I said, "Okay." He said, "I figured." I said, "I have a shelter. Underground. It's small, but it's safe. Are you able to walk?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah." Getting him up and across the 50 meters to the shed took about 5 minutes. He was weaker than he'd appeared lying down. His legs were steady but shaking slightly, the kind of shake that comes from the muscles having been used past their limit for too long. He leaned on me for part of it, which I hadn't done with another person in a very long time, and which felt strange and very human in the way that contact always feels after you've been without it. I got him down the ladder into the outer chamber. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and I got him water, and he drank it slowly, not gulping, which was good, which meant he knew enough about rehydration to take it carefully. Then I gave him crackers and peanut butter, and he ate them with the focused, joyless efficiency of someone who is eating because they need to eat, not because it tastes like anything. His name was Connor Aldrich. He'd been walking for 8 days. He'd come from a town called Millhaven, about 60 kilometers south. He'd been staying with his uncle when the outbreak hit the area. The uncle hadn't survived, and Connor had been moving north on the assumption that it was less bad there. He was wrong about that. It wasn't less bad there. I didn't tell him that for a while. He asked me how long I'd been underground. I said 35 days. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked around the outer chamber, the walls, the hatch above, the door to the inner chamber, and said, "You built this?" I said yes. He said, "Before it started?" I said yes. He said, "How did you know it was going to happen?" And I started to tell him, the long version, from the beginning. And he listened, which was the first time in a very long time that someone had actually just listened. Connor was in bad physical shape when I found him, but nothing that time and food and sleep wouldn't mostly fix. He had a deep blister on his left heel that had gone wrong, infected, the skin around it hard and hot. The kind of thing that, if left alone, becomes a serious problem. I cleaned it with antiseptic from the medical kit, put antibiotic ointment on it, bandaged it properly. He winced once when I cleaned it and then held still, which told me something about him. He was also sunburned, dehydrated, and had a cut on his forearm from what he described as climbing through a window in a hurry that hadn't been properly cleaned. So I dealt with that too. He slept for about 14 hours the first night, on the cot. I slept on the floor of the inner chamber with my jacket under me, which was uncomfortable but manageable. I lay there in the dark after I'd turned the lamp off and listened to him breathe, and found that the sound of another person breathing in a dark room was one of the most fundamentally different things from being alone in a dark room that I'd experienced. I don't know if it was better or worse, just different in a way that went all the way down. The first few days with Connor were strange. Not bad strange, mostly. Just the strangeness of having calibrated to a single-person routine and suddenly having to recalibrate. Sharing the lamp battery, sharing the cooking fuel, recalculating the food stores, which were now going to run out faster, and I needed to think about that seriously. Connor was not talkative. He answered questions when asked, and sometimes volunteered information. But he didn't fill silence with noise, which I appreciated. We'd sit in the inner chamber reading or eating, and sometimes neither of us would say anything for an hour, and it wasn't uncomfortable. I learned things about him in fragments. He was 19, in fact, not 20. He'd been studying electrical engineering at a state college about 3 hours away when the outbreak started, had driven to his uncle's place because he couldn't reach his parents. His parents were in Florida, and he'd spoken to his mom once on the phone on day 3 of the outbreak, when she'd said they were at a shelter center, and then hadn't been able to reach her after that. His uncle was a retired electrician, lived alone, had a decent head for practical things. Connor had learned a lot from him in the 3 weeks they'd been holed up in the uncle's house before things went bad enough that the house wasn't safe anymore. I asked him one evening about 4 days after he'd arrived, "What happened with the uncle?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "He got out." I said, "Okay." He said, "I mean, he got out of the house. We both did. He went a different direction." He didn't say anything else, and I didn't ask. Later, several days later, he mentioned it again. Not as a story, just as a detail in a different conversation. He said, "The thing about my uncle is he was faster than you'd think, for 63. He used to run, like recreationally, which I always thought was insane because he'd also smoke a cigarette afterward, but he was fast." He paused. I think he knew they were going to catch up to him eventually. He went toward them so I could go the other way. I didn't say anything. He continued looking at the wall. After a while, he said, "His name was Dale." Then, not Dale the character in Walking Dead, just he actually liked that show, which was weird to think about right then. I said, "Yeah." We sat there for a while. Day 40 through 41, the thing I still can't entirely explain. I want to preface this by saying I have been underground for over a month, in artificial light, on limited nutrition, with significant and prolonged psychological stress, and I am aware that these conditions are not ideal for reliable perception. I know that. I've read the research on sensory deprivation and its effects. I know what isolation does to the pattern recognition machinery in the human brain, which evolved for a world full of threats and runs hot even in normal conditions. That said, on day 40, in the middle of the night, Connor woke me up. He'd grabbed my arm, which is how I woke. The physical contact. He was sitting up on the cot, and he was very still, and his face had the particular blank quality of someone who is listening with everything they have. I listened too. There was something in the outer chamber. Not a sound from outside. From inside. something in the outer chamber between us and the hatch. The hatch was bolted. The outer chamber door, a steel door I'd hung and reinforced with a second bolt on our side, was closed and bolted. There was nothing in the outer chamber when I'd done my final check before sleep, which I did every night. But there was something in there now. The sound was small. The smallest possible sound. The kind of sound an object makes when it shifts position on a smooth floor by a centimeter. A scrape. A weight redistributed. Not loud, the kind of thing you could easily sleep through or dismiss as the structure settling. Connor and I looked at each other in the dark. I reached for the lamp, slowly, no sudden movement, and turned it on. Turned it down to its lowest setting, which gave just enough light to see each other's faces. I mouthed, "What is that?" He shook his head slightly. He didn't know either. We waited. Another minute passed with no sound. Then, the scrape again. Something shifting, something that had weight to it. The exact sound of a shoe sole sliding on concrete. Now. There was no way into the outer chamber that I hadn't built. The hatch was the only access point, and it was bolted from below. The walls were poured concrete, full thickness. I knew this because I had built it. There was no other entrance. There was no way a person or anything else could be in that room. But something was in that room. Connor had his back against the wall. I picked up the wrench I keep next to the cot. Not a very threatening weapon, but better than nothing. And I went to the steel door and put my hand on the bolt and waited. 3 minutes. No sound. I slid the bolt back slowly, held the wrench, opened the door 6 inches. The outer chamber was empty. The light from my lamp reached about 2/3 of the way in. The far third, near the ladder, was in shadow. I pushed the door fully open and held the lamp up. Nothing. No one. The floor was bare. The hatch was closed. The bolt was in the position I'd left it. Everything was as I'd left it. Connor came and stood behind me and looked around the outer chamber. He said very quietly, "Did we both just—" I said, "Yeah." We stood there for a moment. I went around the outer chamber carefully, looking at the floor, the walls, the hatch. The hatch bolt was firmly in. The walls were walls. There was no place for anything to be hiding. Connor was looking at the far corner, the low shadow area near the base of the ladder. He said, "There's something on the floor there." I went over. There was something on the floor. At first I thought it was a piece of torn insulation or a bit of debris from the construction. Something that had been there since I'd built the place and I'd just never noticed. I crouched down and held the lamp close. It was a book of matches. The paper kind, from a restaurant. The restaurant name on the cover was a place called Reardon's Bar and Grill. I did not put that there. I had never been to Reardon's Bar and Grill. I had no book of restaurant matches in my shelter. I had a box of wooden matches and a lighter and a second lighter as backup, all of which were in the inner chamber on the supply shelf. Connor said, "Was that there before?" I said, "No." He said, "But." I said, "I know." We went back into the inner chamber, and I bolted the door, and we sat on opposite sides of the room and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I've thought about this for 2 days. The explanations I can construct are: something I failed to notice during construction fell from somewhere and landed on the floor, timed improbably to coincide with our exact period of listening. Alternatively, there is access to the outer chamber via some route I'm not aware of, something I missed, some gap in the construction, and something or someone came in, and left the matches. Alternatively, my perception and Connor's perception both failed simultaneously in a way that produced a shared hallucination, which I cannot rule out given our respective conditions, though simultaneous identical hallucinations in two people are not a well-documented phenomenon. I keep the book of matches on the shelf in the inner chamber now. I look at it sometimes. Reardon's Bar and Grill. Day 41. Today. I started this at about 6 this morning, talking into the recorder. It's now looking at my phone. It's now about 4 in the afternoon. Connor is asleep. He's been sleeping a lot still, which is fine, which is his body doing what it needs to do. I've been sitting at the folding table with the recorder and going through all of this from the beginning. And somewhere in the middle of going through it, I realized I hadn't eaten since morning, which is the first time in 41 days I've forgotten to eat on schedule, which is either a sign that this process of talking is good for me in some way, or a sign that I'm getting sloppy with the routines, which I can't afford. I'm going to stop in a moment and eat something. But first I want to say a few things that I haven't said yet, even to myself. The first thing is about Kathleen. She said she'd keep publishing as long as she could. On day 5, before the emergency broadcast system went to its loop, I heard a brief radio news piece from a station that mentioned Dawnfield Media Group had published a series of investigative reports on the outbreak's origin and timeline, attributed to their research team. I don't know who wrote those reports. I don't know if Kathleen was still in the office, or if Derek was, or any of them. The station said the reports were significant and included information about early indicators that had been available months before official acknowledgement. Early indicators that were available months before. I sat with that sentence for a long time. The second thing is about my parents. I've thought about calling them. The phone still works, in the sense that it powers on. But network coverage has been non-existent since about day 4. I could try a text message that might transmit if the cell network ever comes back up for even a few seconds. I've written the text. It's sitting in my outbox. It says, "Mom, Dad, I'm alive. I'm safe. I'm in Crawford County. I love you both. I'll keep trying to reach you." I wrote it on day 3. I look at it sometimes. It still says not sent. The third thing is harder to say. I've been thinking about why I didn't push harder. In February, in March. Why I stopped at Kathleen's office and Patrick's phone call and Derek's desk and put the folder down and drove to Crawford County and started digging for myself. The practical answer is, I did what I could do. I went to the most powerful person I had direct access to. I gave her everything I had, and she made a decision that was professionally and legally defensible, even if it was wrong. I went to my family, and they didn't believe me, and I couldn't force them. I went to a colleague, and he couldn't help. There was no authority to escalate to. No one I could call who would be able to act on the information in time, in a way that would have actually helped anyone. That's the practical answer, and it's true. The other answer is that I stopped trying because it was humiliating. Because every conversation ended with someone looking at me with a particular expression, not quite pity, not quite disbelief, something between them, and saying, "But it's zombies, Joel." Because the gap between the information I had and the category of story it fell into was so wide that I couldn't bridge it without sounding like someone who had decided to live in a movie. And I have always been, deeply uncomfortable with being that person. I value credibility. I value being taken seriously. And being taken seriously requires, in ordinary life, that you not stand in your editor's office and tell her the world is ending. So I stopped trying earlier than I might have if I'd cared less about what people thought of me. That's the truth of it. Not the whole truth, but a significant part of it. And I've been sitting with that for 41 days. I want to keep talking, actually. I don't want to stop. There's something about saying it all out loud that makes it feel less like a weight and more like a record. Something that exists outside of my head. Let me tell you about the food system in more detail, because the practical things feel worth documenting. The 412 cans I stocked were in specific categories, and I organized them by category on the shelves. Protein sources: canned sardines, tuna, chicken, beans, lentils, chickpeas. 68 cans in that category. Vegetables: corn, peas, green beans, tomatoes, spinach. 83 cans. Fruits: peaches, pears, mandarin oranges, pineapple. 44 cans. Soups and stews: 31 cans, which I've been treating as a morale category rather than a primary nutrition category because they're lower calorie density. And then bulk dry goods: the rice, the oats, the pasta, the dried beans, which live in sealed 5-gallon buckets and are harder to track by unit. One thing I learned quickly is that the body doesn't just want calories, it wants variety. And when variety disappears, the brain starts to compensate in strange ways. By day 15, I was dreaming about food. Not in an agonized way, not starvation dreams, just ordinary food. The kind you don't think about when you have it. A diner breakfast I used to get on Saturday mornings at a place near my apartment. Eggs over easy, home fries with a lot of pepper, wheat toast that was slightly too dark, orange juice in a small glass. I'd been getting that breakfast for 3 years and never thought about it particularly. And now I dreamed about it in specific sensory detail that I could not have produced consciously. I started to think carefully about the rotation, making sure that what I ate each day hit different taste categories, different textures. Salty, sweet, something with an acid note if I could manage it. The tinned mandarin oranges became enormously valuable for this reason. The taste of them, sweet, slightly bitter at the segment edges, nothing to do with anything underground, was a useful kind of shock to the system once or twice a week. With Connor now in the shelter, the food calculations have shifted. 2 people instead of 1. So the timeline compresses. I've gone back through the counts, and with careful rationing, we probably have 50 to 60 days left. 50 to 60 days from now, which takes us into mid to late September. I've started thinking about what comes after this. Not in a hopeful way exactly. Not in the maybe things will be better by then way that I know is how people survive psychologically, but that I can't quite allow myself. More in an analytical way. By September, the situation outside will be one of several things. Completely unresolved, with no meaningful change. Unlikely, things don't stay static over months. Somewhat reduced, with the initial acute outbreak having passed its peak and survivors starting to organize. Possible. Or some form of different danger, secondary effects like disease from unburied dead, violence from desperate survivors, resource conflicts, quite possible. What I can say is that being underground indefinitely is not a long-term survival strategy. I have enough for maybe 60 more days. After that, I have to surface. And when I surface, I have to find food. And finding food means moving through whatever is outside. And whatever is outside is going to require a different set of skills than the ones I've been using down here. Connor's electrical engineering knowledge and the fact that he grew up with a practical-minded uncle have already turned out to be useful in ways I didn't expect. He looked at my ventilation system on his third day here and made 3 adjustments to the pipe joins that improved the airflow noticeably. He looked at my solar trickle charger setup and reconfigured it to be more efficient. Said he wasn't sure it was running at full capacity, and he was right. After the reconfiguration, the battery bank charges faster. He knows things I don't know. We've talked cautiously about what the plan is. Not a lot. Neither of us has wanted to say it out loud. In a way that commits us to it, I think, because saying it out loud makes it something we'll have to actually do. But the conversations have started. Short, indirect, the shape of a plan forming around the edges, without being directly stated. Day 41, evening. Connor's awake now. He's sitting on the cot reading or trying to read. He's on the military thriller I put down after 3 chapters, which tells me either he doesn't know what the book is about or he has a stronger stomach than I do, or possibly both. The lamp is on its mid-setting, which gives the room a slightly warmer light than the full setting. The CO2 monitor reads normal. The water tank is holding steady at about 350 liters, which is fine. I ate dinner an hour ago, sardines and rice and canned corn, which sounds miserable and honestly tasted fine, which is either because my standards have adjusted or because hunger is a reliable seasoning. Connor looked up from the book a few minutes ago and said, "This book's messed up." I said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "Did you pick this on purpose?" I said, "No. I picked everything for length." He said, "There's a part where they're in a hospital." He paused. "It's very, yeah." I said, "You can stop reading it." He said, "I know." He went back to it. I've been thinking about the sounds that have been coming from outside today. Different from usual. Quieter in some ways. There was a period this afternoon where I could hear almost nothing beyond the wind in the trees and occasional bird sounds, which used to be the default but has become unusual enough that it feels loaded with potential meaning. Either nothing is near the property right now, or the things that are near the property are being quiet, which they don't do on purpose, which means nothing is near the property right now, or something different is near the property, something that is quiet intentionally. I'm trying not to think about that one too hard. The matches from day 40 are still on the shelf. I picked them up this morning, just to look at them again. The cover of the matchbook is red and white. Reardon's in a script font, a cartoon pint glass. The matches inside are the paper kind, fold out, about half of them used, the stubs dark. The cover has a small water stain on the lower left corner. I pressed it open flat on the table and looked at the inside cover. And there's something written there in ink, just a phone number, handwritten, with a little circle around it. No name. I wrote the number in my notebook. I don't know whose it is, and I have no way to call it, and probably will never be able to call it. But I wrote it down. There's a habit of documentation that I can't turn off, even down here. Even in a room where the audience for the documentation is just me and one sleeping 19-year-old and maybe the concrete walls. What I want to put on record, and this is the part I've been avoiding all day, talking around it, getting to other things first, is what I think about now. What runs through my mind during the walking loops, the meal preparation, the silence of the sleep hours. I think about the people I know and whether they're alive. I do this systematically, which is probably not healthy, but I can't seem to not do it. I go through the list of people whose faces I can place. I try to estimate, based on what I know about each of them and their likely location and circumstances on June 8th, whether they probably survived. Patrick, Denver. Denver was affected, but later than the eastern cities. He has Carol and 2 kids and would have been motivated to move fast. Carol's family has a property somewhere more rural, I half remember. My estimate, possible, maybe 50-50. My parents, Columbus, Ohio. My dad's heart condition and my mom's diabetes would be serious complications for any kind of sustained stress or disruption of medication supply. My estimate, which I hate, less than 50-50, significantly less. Kathleen was in the office on June 8th in a major city. The major cities were the worst in the first weeks. She's sharp and practical and knows how to make decisions under pressure. But knowing how to make decisions under pressure and being in the right place at the right time aren't the same thing. My estimate, I can't. Derek, 29, no dependents, probably some physical fitness, smart. Started from a major city. My estimate, possible. My epidemiologist contact. I don't even know where she was located. I know her name. First name only, Laura. She was alarmed by what I'd sent her and was trying to escalate it. I hope that urgency translated to action. Sandra Holt, 44 Birchwood Drive, Crestfield. I don't know. And I think about the people on the highway. On June 8th, when I drove past the stopped cars and heard the sounds and drove onto the shoulder, I think about them a lot. The cars that were there, the people who were in them. I made a choice on June 8th that I would get to my shelter. I was single-minded about it. I had a plan, and I was executing it, and the plan was for one person, and I'd already established in my own mind that one person was all I could accommodate. And when I drove past those stopped cars, I did not stop. I drove around them and kept going. And I have turned that over in my head every single day. Every single day. The thing about being a researcher is you know how to build an argument, and I've built every argument in both directions. And both directions have merit, and neither direction resolves it. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stopped. I don't know how many people I could have helped. I don't know if stopping would have meant I never got here, never survived, which would also have been a bad outcome. But for whom, and weighed against what, and who gets to decide? These questions don't have answers. I know they don't have answers. I keep asking them anyway, at 3 in the morning with the lamp off, lying on the floor with my jacket under me and Connor breathing on the cot 3 feet away. Okay, let me talk about the future. The actual future, not the middle of the night version. We have somewhere between 50 and 60 days of food at current consumption rates. I could extend that by cutting portions further, but we're already not eating a lot, and further reduction starts to create physical performance problems. Cognitive function, immune response, the ability to move quickly if we need to, which are problems I can't afford when I'm planning to move through open space. The car is in the trees. It needs fuel. I left it at about a quarter tank, and some of that will have evaporated over the weeks. And a quarter tank doesn't get you far if you're navigating around roads that might be blocked. Connor thinks he can siphon from other cars if we can find them. I believe him because he explained exactly how he'd do it, and the explanation made sense. And he said his uncle had taught him. What we need before we surface, a route. I have a county map and a state map, both paper, both in the shelter. We've been looking at them. Connor knows the area between Millhaven and Crawford County fairly well from his 8 days of walking. I know the areas I drove through. We've been building a picture, not complete, lots of gaps, but better than nothing. A plan for encountering the infected during movement. Not a weapons plan, exactly. I have a hammer and a wrench, and Connor found a long-handled tool I'd brought down for construction, a concrete chisel that he's been keeping near the cot. These are not good weapons, but they're something. More important than weapons is movement strategy, noise discipline, route selection, moving early morning, avoiding population centers, staying off main roads where possible. We've talked through this in fragments. A destination. This is where we've been least clear with each other. My mental map of the situation says, away from population density, toward rural areas, ideally somewhere with accessible food sources, farmland, water access, and structures that can be defensively held without requiring the kind of resources we don't have. Connor's mental map, which is shaped by his 8 days walking, says, north, away from the city clusters, toward the lake regions. These aren't incompatible. We've been circling around the same general direction without quite committing to it. I've been putting off committing because committing means saying out loud that a day is coming when we open that hatch and climb out and don't come back. And whatever has been accumulating outside over 41 days is going to be what it is. And we're going to have to move through it. I'm not afraid in the same way I was afraid on day one. The fear has changed shape over 41 days. It's less sharp, less immediate. It's become something more like a settled background, fact. The way being cold is a fact, not a crisis. If you've been cold long enough to understand that cold is something you manage rather than something that happens to you. What I feel more than fear, if I'm being precise about it, is a kind of watchfulness, an attention turned outward, toward everything outside the concrete walls, measuring what I can hear against what I know, and trying to build from those measurements a picture of what the world looks like now, what it's become, what will be waiting. Something I've been meaning to document and keep forgetting. The reading. By day 41, I've finished 11 of the 47 books. The practical guides I've been going through methodically. Field medicine, wilderness foraging, small-scale food preservation, map reading, and land navigation. The foraging guide in particular I've read twice and taken notes on. And I've been quizzing Connor on edible plants because it seemed like knowledge worth having two people carry rather than one. The fiction I've been less systematic about. I finished a long historical novel that someone had given me years ago and I'd never opened, which was completely absorbing in the way that long books from a different time and place absorb you when you're isolated. Not because the world in the book is better, just because it's different. It's other. It's not concrete walls and a CO2 monitor. I read it over 5 days and felt genuinely sad when it ended, not because of the plot, just because the other world it had briefly provided was gone. Connor has been reading faster than me. He's gone through 7 books in the 10 days he's been here, which averages to almost 1 book a day. I asked him about this, and he said, I have a lot of catching up to do. I thought he meant with sleep or food. And then I looked at him and realized he meant with reading specifically. He said, I didn't read much before this. I thought I was too busy. He said it in a matter-of-fact way, not particularly self-pitying. Just a fact. I gave him the foraging guide, and he read that too. The radio. I should say more about the radio because it's been one of the more disorienting and also most important sources of information I have. After the ham operator in Pennsylvania went quiet on day 12, I spent about a week without finding anything useful on the shortwave bands. Static, carrier waves without signals, occasional fragments of something that might have been a broadcast, but resolved into nothing. I kept scanning. Every evening, half an hour on the dial. Day 20. I found a signal. Strong, consistent, broadcasting on a specific shortwave frequency every night, between what seemed like 9 and 10 p.m. A woman's voice, speaking in a measured cadence, clearly reading from a prepared text. No name given for herself or for what she was broadcasting from. The content was location reports of organized survivor groups, town names, coordinates given in a code that took me a few days to figure out, a grid reference system using state highway numbers as coordinates, not original, but functional. Status of those groups, what resources they had or needed. She'd been broadcasting based on the numbering system she used for her reports for about 3 weeks before I found her. The reports were terse and informational. No sentiment. No stay strong. Just data. Which I found very useful and also, in a way I'm still thinking about, weirdly reassuring. Someone was still gathering and transmitting organized information. Someone had decided that information infrastructure was worth maintaining. I've been writing down every location report she gives. My shortwave notebook, a separate notebook from my main diary, has 12 pages of location data. There are groups, not just individuals, not just people in drainage channels, actual organized groups, some of them substantial. One report described a group of over 300 people at a regional high school about 40 miles from where I am. 300 people. That's not nothing. I haven't told Connor about all of it yet. I've told him about the woman broadcasting, about the general pattern of what she reports. But I haven't shown him the notebook or talked about the high school group. Because doing that is a step toward deciding that's where we go. And I haven't decided that yet. I'm going to have to decide. There's one more thing I want to put on record before I stop for tonight. On my list of things I did right and things I did wrong, I want to be accurate. Things I did right. I built the shelter. I stocked it correctly, mostly. I built the ventilation properly. That one I'm genuinely proud of, because ventilation is the thing most people get wrong. And I got it right. I brought enough books. I brought the paper maps. I brought enough medical supplies. Things I did wrong. I should have brought more fuel canisters for the camp stove. I should have thought more carefully about the food calorie calculations when adding a second person. Not that I planned for a second person. But if I had, it would have been better. I should have brought a water filter as backup for the rainwater collection. I should have brought more varied food. The absence of anything fresh, anything with texture beyond soft or dry, has been a consistent low-grade problem. The biggest thing I did wrong, I didn't have a communications plan. I built the shelter and stocked it and sealed myself in and had no way to communicate with anyone outside and no plan to develop one. The radio is receive only, not transmit. If I needed help, I had no way to call for it. If the people I cared about needed to reach me, they had no way to do that. I think about that a lot. The shortwave woman with her coordinates and her group reports. Somewhere out there, someone set up a transmitter and started broadcasting, and people like me with receivers can hear her and triangulate toward the information she provides. She had a plan that involved other people. My plan involved only me. I designed it that way on purpose, because I'd failed to convince anyone to come with me, and because I believed, and maybe still believe, that the cleanest survival plan is the one that doesn't depend on anyone else. Connor would disagree with that. He hasn't said so directly. But 10 days of watching him, I can tell that he's someone who works better as part of something than alone. It's in the way he immediately started contributing, looking for problems to solve. asking about the systems and how they worked and whether they could be improved. He doesn't sit still. He processes things by doing. I process things by thinking and writing and talking into a recorder at 4 p.m. Maybe that's why it worked out that we ended up here together. Neither of us is sufficient on our own. Day 41, late evening. Connor fell asleep again about an hour ago. The lamp is on low. The CO2 monitor ticks its gentle, regular reading. The matchbook from Reardon's Bar and Grill is on the shelf. Outside, if I listen very carefully in the particular silence that happens after midnight, I can sometimes hear almost nothing. Not completely nothing. There's always something, wind or insects, or a distant sound that resolves into ambiguity by the time it reaches me. But almost nothing. I've been thinking about what almost nothing means. Whether it means the density outside is thinning. Whether the months are doing what time does to a biological system that isn't maintaining itself. Whether whatever is driving them is sustainable indefinitely, or whether it burns through something eventually. The research I'd done suggested it wasn't indefinite, that the pathogen required a living host, and a living host required nutrition, and these weren't things the infected were managing well, which suggested eventual deterioration, which suggested a timeline. I don't know the timeline. I have guesses, and the guesses are based on incomplete information, and I've been wrong before about timelines. But the sounds outside, over 41 days, have changed. The density of the wrong sounds has gone down. Not to nothing, but down. I'm going to sleep now. Before I do, I want to say one more thing to whoever ends up hearing this, if anyone does. I knew. I knew months before it happened, and I knew what it was, and I built a place to survive in, and I'm still alive. And the part of me that spent 6 months being told I was wrong and paranoid and ridiculous is tempted to feel something about that. Justified, maybe? Or vindicated? But I don't. I don't feel that. What I feel is something much simpler and much sadder, which is that I wish I'd been wrong. I wish, with everything I have, that the thing I found in that communication in January had turned out to be a clerical error or a false alarm or my own pattern recognition running hot on a slow week. I wish it had been the thing Patrick and Derek and everyone else thought it was, which was a story a frightened person told themselves because they worked too hard and didn't sleep enough and read too many alarming documents. I wish it had been just a story. It wasn't. I'm going to sleep now. Tomorrow I'm going to talk to Connor seriously about the route, about the high school group, about what comes after this. We're going to make a plan, a real plan with a date attached to it. And then we're going to execute it. Because being right about something doesn't mean anything if you stay underground forever. The lamp is going off. Day 42. I woke up to the sound of rain. Not the muffled pressure change I'd noticed before when it rained. The subtle ventilation difference that told me water was falling somewhere above me. This was rain I could genuinely hear. A consistent sound. Layered, the hard surface sound of water on the shed roof above filtered down through the hatch, arriving in the outer chamber as a faint but unmistakable continuous rush. I lay on the floor and listened to it for about 5 minutes before I did anything else. Connor was already awake, lying on the cot looking at the ceiling. He said, "Rain?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How heavy?" I said, "Sounds like a lot." We lay there listening. The sound of rain from underground is not like the sound of rain in a normal room. It's compressed somehow, compressed and hollowed, and it arrives as more of a presence than a sound. A shift in the ambient quality of the air, a feeling of something large and indifferent happening above you. It doesn't feel like shelter when rain sounds like that. It feels like the shelter is in the rain. Like the rain is the whole world, and the shelter is just a smaller thing inside it. The tank would be filling. Connor said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "The tank." He said, "No, you're not." I didn't answer. He said, "I've been thinking about going north, the lake thing. There's a town I passed through or near. I didn't go into it, but I could see it from high ground, about a day and a half walking from where I found that elevated road junction. It looked quieter than the areas I'd come through, like genuinely quieter. No movement I could see from the distance." I said, "How far from here?" He said, "Walking, maybe 3 or 4 days. Driving, if the roads are passable, maybe a few hours, depending." I said, "What's the town called?" He said, "Aldenmere." I got up and got the state map off the shelf. Aldenmere. I found it after about 30 seconds, a small dot on the map, population probably a few thousand, on the southern edge of a large lake system, connected to the main road network by a secondary road that ran through mostly agricultural land. From my property, roughly northeast, about 60 kilometers. I put my finger on it. Connor sat up and looked over my shoulder. I said, "The shortwave. There's a group I've been hearing about. High school about 40 miles from here, about half the distance to Aldenmere." He said, "Which direction?" I said, "East of here." He was quiet, looking at the map. He said, "Stop on the way?" I said, "I was thinking about it." He said, 300 people sounds like either a really good thing or a really bad thing." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do we need to decide right now?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay." We looked at the map for a while. The rain kept coming. Day 43. Something happened today that I need to document while it's still fresh, because I want to be precise about the sequence. And I know from experience that memory is not precise about sequences. It compresses and rearranges. At around 11 in the morning, I was in the middle of my walking loop, and I heard from outside a voice. Not the kind of indistinct sound that might be language I'd heard weeks ago. An actual voice. A person speaking in full sentences, in a tone of ordinary conversation. Not yelling, not calling for help, just talking. The way you talk to someone walking next to you. Connor heard it too. He was reading on the cot, and he looked up immediately, and we looked at each other. The voice spoke for about 30 seconds, long enough for me to distinguish it as a male voice, adult, speaking English, too muffled to make out specific words. Then a second voice, different pitch, also adult, also ordinary conversational. 2 people, talking to each other. They stopped. Then footsteps, unmistakably footsteps, the crunch of dry grass, rhythmic and purposeful, and completely unlike the shuffling sound I'd learned to associate with the infected. 2 people walking, talking to each other, near my property. Connor was off the cot. He looked at me and said very quietly, "Do we?" I held up one hand. The footsteps continued for about a minute, getting slightly closer and then leveling off. They were passing by rather than coming directly toward the shed. The voices murmured again, briefly. Then both sounds began to fade, moving away. Then one of them said something in a raised voice, not yelling, just louder, directed, addressing something. And another voice answered, from a different direction. 3 people, not 2. I went to the outer chamber. Slow, no sound. Connor followed, I put my ear as close to the hatch as I could without touching it. I could hear 3 distinct voices. Movement, several sets of feet. No shuffling, no vocalization of the wrong kind. The creak of something. A bag on someone's back, maybe. Or a cart being wheeled, that particular stressed, repetitive sound. They were loading or unloading something near the shed. Not inside the shed, but near it. I reached for the hatch bolt. Connor put his hand on my arm. He shook his head. I looked at him. He mouthed, "Wait." We waited. 7 minutes. I counted in my head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The sounds moved around the shed perimeter and then receded. The voices faded. Footsteps faded. After another 5 minutes of silence, I opened the hatch, carefully, 2 inches. I could smell the wet air from last night's rain, green and cold. Wood smoke, faint, from far off. The slight animal smell of people who'd been outside for a long time without washing. I opened the hatch fully and climbed out. The shed was empty. I opened the shed door and stepped out. The property was empty. The drainage channel, empty. The road, as much as I could see of it, nothing moving. But in the mud near the shed, where the rain had softened the ground, there were footprints. 3 sets, roughly, different sizes. They'd come from the direction of the road, circled the shed, and gone back toward the road. They hadn't tried the shed door. Near the corner of the shed, half buried in the mud where it had apparently been left or dropped, was a Ziploc bag. The kind that seals at the top. Inside it, visible through the plastic, a folded piece of paper. I stood there for a moment. Then I picked it up. Inside the bag, the paper was a handwritten note. The handwriting was cramped and practical, not careful about presentation, just focused on being legible. Whoever is in this structure, we know you're here. Saw smoke from cooking vent 3 weeks ago. Not hostile. We have a camp 4 miles east on Renner Road at the old grain storage facility. 47 people have food and medical. We come through this route every 5 to 6 days. Leave a response here if you want contact. T. I read it 3 times. I went back inside, down the ladder. I showed it to Connor. He read it again. Then he said, "How long ago did they leave it?" I said, "I don't know. It's in a sealed bag, so the paper's not wet. Could have been any of the last few times they came through." He said, 3 weeks ago they saw the vent smoke." I said, "Yeah." He said, "So they've been coming by on purpose, waiting for us to respond." I said, "Apparently." He was quiet for a moment, running his thumb along the edge of the paper. Then he said, "T?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you want to respond?" I sat down on the floor of the outer chamber. The paper was in my hand. The note from T, whoever T was, 47 people at a grain storage facility 4 miles east. I thought about the 50 days of food I had left, about Aldenmere on the map, about the high school group 40 miles away, about the woman's voice on the shortwave, her coordinates and her data and her nightly reports that asked for nothing and expected nothing and just kept broadcasting. I said, "Yeah, I want to respond." Connor nodded. Then he said, "What are you going to write?" I thought about it for a moment. What do you say to someone who has been walking past your shelter for weeks, leaving a note in a Ziploc bag, hoping you'd come out? I went into the inner chamber and got the notebook and a pen. Tore out a clean page. Wrote, "2 of us. We're well. We have supplies we can contribute. We'll come to Renner Road in 3 days. Leave a signal if it's not safe. We'll be watching from the road before we approach. My name is Joel. The other is Connor." I folded it, put it in the Ziploc bag with T's note, and climbed back up to the surface. Put it in the same spot where T's note had been, wedged into the mud near the shed corner so it wouldn't blow away. Went back down, sealed the hatch, sat in the outer chamber for a while. 3 days. Day 43 continued. I'm going to finish the recording now. Not because there's nothing left to say. There's always more to say. And the habit of talking into this thing has become something I can't quite stop. The way you can't stop picking at a thought once you've started. But because the 3 days between now and Renner Road feel like a transition, and I want to mark the transition properly. 43 days. That's how long I've been in this shelter, or associated with it, since I sealed the hatch. 43 days of lamplight and oatmeal and walking loops, and the CO2 monitor and the voice on the shortwave, and the book of matches from Reardon's Bar and Grill sitting on the shelf. I'm going to bring the matches. I don't know why. It seems important to carry the things that don't quite make sense, alongside the things that do. Here's what I know on day 43. I know how to build something with my hands when I've never built anything before in my life. I know that information without action is not enough, and action without information is not enough either. And the thing you're looking for is the specific point where they meet. I know that the distance between knowing something is going to happen and being believed can be wider than any other distance, and that gap costs things that can't be recovered. I know that people are still organizing, still leaving notes in Ziploc bags, still broadcasting coordinates on shortwave radios in the middle of the night. I know that Connor Aldrich slept 14 hours his first day here and is now awake more hours than I am, and that his Uncle Dale went the other way so Connor could go the other way, and that there are people who do things like that, and there always have been. I know that my parents' phone number is in my contacts, and the text message to them still says, "Not sent," and will continue to say that until the network comes back up, if it comes back up, and that I'm going to keep trying. I know that Aldenmere is a small dot on the state map northeast of here, and that the roads between here and there go through agricultural land, and that agricultural land has food growing in it, or food that can be grown in it, and that we have a car hidden in the trees and a 19-year-old who knows how to siphon fuel. I know that T has 46 other people at a grain storage facility on Renner Road, and that they've been walking their route and checking their note spot for weeks, and that whoever T is, they kept coming back. 3 days. I'm going to eat dinner. I'm going to walk my loop one more time. I'm going to write in the notebook and check the CO2 monitor and crank the radio and try the shortwave. And in 3 days, I'm going to climb up the ladder and come out into whatever is up there. With Connor next to me and a wrench in my hand and 43 days of underground thinking in my head. And I'm going to walk 4 miles east on a road I've never been on before to meet a person I know only as T. The lamp is still on. The matchbook is on the shelf. I'm going to leave it there when we go, for whoever comes after. So they know someone was here, that someone made it.